Hello and welcome to this lecture, Defining and Initializing Arrays. Now, a lot of occasions you might want to have a variable, so you declare a variable. What if you want 3 variables? You might want to declare A, B, C. But what if you want 30 or 50 variables? You can't just go on declaring variables with different names. This is where a data structure like array comes into help. So, arrays are declared as one single variable but hold a bunch of values. It is accessed via something called index, so we call it as an indexed collection. Now, it is also an object in Java. Now, at the end of this video, you should be able to declare an array, construct an array object with some initializations, and use arrays and access array elements. Now, an array is a data structure that defines an indexed collection, which means that you declare one variable to hold a collection of values. Now, the elements in the array, which are the individual values in each of those array elements, now they all are having the same name, and also each element are of the same data type. Now, arrays are objects in Java, which means you need to allocate memory. Obviously, we allocate memory with the help of new keyword. A position in the array is indicated by a non-negative integer value called as an index. Now, it always starts from 0 and you say array of 0, array of 1, array of 2 and so on. An element is at a given position is accessed always using an index. In languages like C or C++, you can also access that with the help of an address arithmetic. You can't do that in Java. Now, the size of an array can be decided at the runtime, unlike C and C++. In C and C++, the array declaration comes with a size. So, if you want to have 3 elements, you declare the array saying that I need 3 elements. You can't use a variable to say, hey, I need an array of n number of elements where n has a value. Now, in Java, you can do that. Now, once initialized, you cannot grow or shrink the array. So, array size becomes frozen. If you reinitialize it, it becomes altogether another array object. The previously created array object gets memory corrected over a period of time. Now, arrays can be of primitives or of reference types. Now, most of the time we start with an example of primitives, but then we will look into arrays of references too. Now, each array object has a final field called as a length. So, like in our classes, we will have some member variables. Array object also has one member variable whose value cannot be changed, and it's called as length, and it defines what is the size. So, at any point in time, if you want to check what is the array size, especially when you're trying to access the elements, you start from the 0, but till where I should be going through. So, the length will help you there. Now, the first element is always accessed from 0. Now, let's see how to declare an array. An array declaration includes an element type and a square bracket and a variable. Now, the square bracket can be placed either as a prefix to the variable or as a suffix to the variable. Now, note that the element type is not for the array, but for the array's individual members. So, if you have 10 integers, you have to say int and followed by square brackets and a variable. Let's see some examples of declaring. Now, here we have 3 declarations. The first one is the simplest. You say int, a pair of square brackets and numbers. So, numbers is an array to hold a bunch of int values. The second one that says int, a square bracket, that represents an array declaration. A, B, C, all the 3 of them are arrays. However, the last one, x with a pair of square brackets, is an array declaration. Y and Z are not arrays. Now, it is important to understand that the declaration of the array itself does not create an array, because we simply say that it is just a pair of square bracket. We didn't mention the size also. So, it declares a reference that can denote or that can refer to an array object in the future. Now, the square brackets, these signify the variable is not a primitive, but just it's a reference. Now, like any other reference, references of class types or interface types, this is also a reference of the similar nature, which means in a 64-bit computer, so you're going to have 8 bytes given for this particular reference. Now, you cannot specify the size of the array in the square bracket while declaring. As you can see, the element type, variable and a size in the bracket is an error. It's a compilation error. The square bracket is only to signify that variable is an array, not an individual element. So let's see how to construct an array. Now we always have to use new keyword to define how many elements that we need. Now often it's combined with the declaration. So we say array name equals to new element or element type, and then in the square bracket we say what's the size. For example, numbers equals to new int of 5. We are telling the compiler that hey, I need 5 integers. In fact, you're telling it to the runtime because objects are created at the runtime. Now this allocates a size of for example 5 times size of integer. So that happens to be 4 bytes into 5, so 20 bytes are contiguously reserved in the memory. Now it is compartmentalized as one integer, second integer, third integer and so on. Now the minimum value of the array size that you can use is 0, just to indicate that hey, I have an array but it doesn't have any values. Now if you store negatives in that, if you say I want a new int of -1 or -5 or something like that, you get negative array size exception. Now this is going to prevent your program execution, so be careful about that. Now let's look at how to construct an array and what happens in the memory. Now we initialize values. So we can say int and a declaration of an array with int of numbers equals to a pair of brackets and a series of values in it. So we have 12, 33 and 49. And note that we did not use the keyword new here. It is implicitly allocated based on how many initializers we have. Now since there are 3 of them, the total size allocated is 3 times the size of int, which is 4 bytes. So it's 12 bytes that are reserved in the memory. Now let's have a look at how this is going to work. So we first create a variable called numbers of an array type. Now in the stack, it just reserves a space required for a reference. Now in the next statement we are saying numbers equals to new int of 3. Now this is where on the heap a memory allocation takes place. Now since we said 3 int is what we require, so 12 bytes are reserved plus a space required for an integer field, that is length, is also given. So even though we say that 3 is what we needed, the array contains 4 variables or 4 values. The first 3 of them is what I can access as numbers of 0, numbers of 1 and numbers of 2. Now also observe in the heap int holds a default value of 0, so all of them are initialized to 0. The length is a final field which contains the number of elements are there. So you can say numbers.length and you would get 3 as the values. So let's see how we can initialize. Java provides the means of declaring, constructing and explicitly initializing an array in one declaration statement. That means you declare a variable and initialize them. So we have here element type, something like int or employee or string, and then followed by a pair of square brackets, array name. Now you can interchange the array name and the square brackets here, and then you say equals to, in curly bracket, you can initialize that. Now let's have a look at. Now this applies to members as well as local arrays, meaning if you have a class and inside that class you have an array variable, there also you can do a declaration as well as initialization. Or if you have a local variable as a function's local variable, then you can do that there also. Now the array initialize list is a series of comma separated values of 0 or more expressions. So that means you can just put an empty curly bracket which is equivalent to a 0 sized array. Now such an array initialization block results in the construction and initialization of the array. It implicitly does that. So here is an example, int an array, which is an array declaration, equals to, in bracket we have a bunch of values. Now this, an array here, is declared as an array to hold 10 integer elements. So now assigning an array initializer list later point in time will cause a compilation error. So an array equals to 12 or some numbers if you give, and that's going to be an error here because you have to do this implicit allocation only during declaration. But you can use new keyword along with the initializer to do that. For example, I can say an array where I've already declared that in advance equals to new int of and then say 22, 33, 44. And this is perfectly alright statement. In case if an array was pointing already to another array object, that is now ready for garbage collection because this is a new memory now. So how do we access an array element? Individual array elements are accessed using the same square bracket, like in C or C++ if you have worked with that. Now, array name in square bracket you specify an index expression. Now we call it as index expression because it need not be an int value, it can be a variable, it can be an expression, it can even be a function call that returns an integer. Now each individual element is treated as a simple variable of that particular type. So if you say array name of 5 and that is an integer, so you retrieved a single int value. So array name and an index expression. The index is specified with this index expression, which can be any expression that evaluates a non-negative integer value. Remember, having a negative value will throw a negative index exception. Now, the index ranges from 0 to array name dot length minus 1. So this can be a good idea to be used in a for loop. So I can say for I equals to 0, I less than array name dot length minus 1 or I less than array name dot length, and I can continue with that loop. Now, if index is outside the range, something like you have an array of 10, so the max index is 9, and you're trying to access the 10th index, you get array index out of bounds exception. It is always a good idea to check is the index you're trying to access well within the range of 0 and array name dot length minus 1. So the array name can be any expression here. While the index happens to be a non-negative number, the name of the array itself can be any expression that signifies an array. Now here is an example. Vinod here is a string. Now Vinod.toChar will return an array of characters. Now since array of characters is an object, you are trying to access that reference, and so you have an array reference, and using that array reference you say, hey, give me the second element in that array. And since we have a character array and the second, meaning the third positioned value is n, so you get that particular n. Now the reason is that index always start with 0, so 2 means the third element. Now the array operator, the square bracket, can be used for declaring the array types, can be used for initializing the value, like for example I want 10 integers, so I can say I want new int of 10, so the square bracket is used over there again. Now it can also be used for accessing individual element, so it is considered as an array operator. Now how do we use arrays? Generally the arrays are most commonly used using a for loop. Now here is an example. We start with I equals to 0 because array index always start from 0 and we go till the last element. Now the last element in the array has an index of array.length minus 1, and since we are using I less than that, so obviously we are talking about array length minus 1. So the max value here in this loop for I is array length minus 1. Now then inside the loop we process ARR of I. Now here is an example. We have an array of numbers and we have 4 numbers, 12, 44, 323 and 598. Now here is a loop that begins from 0 and goes till numbers.length minus 1 because we checked I is less than or less than that, not equals to. Now inside that we are printing numbers of I, that means numbers of 0, numbers of 1 and numbers of 2 and so on, plus a tabulator, and then we have a plus math.square root of number. So we basically want the square root of all those 4 numbers, and the output will be something like this. Let's quickly summarize what we have learned in the arrays. Now array is a data structure where elements have the same data type. so they are often called as homogeneous collection. Now, array size is fixed once it is created. Arrays can be of primitive type or of reference types. Declaration of array only declares a simple reference variable that in the future can point to an object. Now, initialization of an array applies to the members of that array as well as local arrays. And individual array elements are accessed by specifying the index values.